Aldo Matze here, welcoming you to my podcast, Shaping Your Journey. My guest, Glen Velez, is a four-time Grammy Award winner in frame drumming, and he is considered the father of modern-day frame drumming, and he's probably one of the first, or the first, percussionist to have achieved such a wide international recognition and a soloist career, performing not only solo but also with orchestras, symphony orchestras, and many other artists such as Steve Reich, John Cage, Pat Metheny, Lyle Mays, and many, many others. He was also my teacher when I first began studying frame drumming and certainly opened my eyes. His work with cross-cultural techniques and inventing new genres is now legendary. Don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel to receive new and upcoming episodes. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, Glen Velez. Thank you, Glen, for joining me on this conversation of Shaping Your Journey. It's really nice to see you again. And of course, I've known you for many, many years, and we'll talk about that. But thank you so much for being on.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
And before we get going on the theme of Shaping Your Journey, if you wouldn't mind just talking to us a little bit about where it started for you. What was like your starting line way back that you remember that got all this going for you?
Well, the drumming journey started. I have an uncle who's a drummer. He passed away a number of years ago, but my father was a trumpet player, and those two are brothers. So my father and his brother, trumpet and drums, and they played from the time they were kids. And so I was around that music and seeing them playing in little clubs and restaurants and bars. Nothing high end, but they were local working musicians. So my father kind of dropped out of the scene because he wanted to have a regular job and have security because he started a family. But my uncle kept on playing as a freelance drummer around town. This was in Dallas, Texas. So I used to go to see him play, and sometimes my father. And I always just liked drums. I mean, the two instruments that I gravitated to were drums and clarinet. And there was a clarinet player that played in the band that I used to see often. And I just loved to watch him play. And I never took lessons or anything, but I just liked the sound of the clarinet. But the drums were always first. And that was from the time I guess the earliest time was, watching drummers on TV, seeing them when I was a little tiny kid. And then I started to take lessons from my uncle when I was about 7 or 8, around 7 or 8, I think. And, we just had a practice pad, and he started to show me the rudiments and the basics, the roll and whatever, and that's how I started. And then after I studied for a year or two with him, he said, you need to go to a real teacher, somebody that you can learn the basics from and learn how to read and all that. So then I started to take lessons, and, that started the whole thing.
And that was in Dallas?
Yeah, this was all in Dallas, Texas. Yep.
And then because I know you were a percussionist. You were playing marimba, you're playing all the percussion instruments. You went on to study formally at a university, or just study with individuals?
Yeah, no, I started on the snare drum, and then there's a track, a progression that people follow. So the teacher told me when I was in junior high school, he said, you should take some mallet, marimba and vibe lessons. So I went to do that when I was in high school. And Then I studied a little bit of timpani in high school also from a man who played with the Dallas Symphony, Cal Cherry was his name. And so I had the basics on all those instruments, and then I, knew the next progression was to go to music school, college and conservatory. So I went up to New York and auditioned for the Mannes College and Manhattan School of Music. And I decided to go to Manhattan, and there I studied with a man named Fred Hinger, who was the timpanist with the Metropolitan Opera, and he had played with the Philadelphia Orchestra for many years. So, and he was great. He was really a thinker about music and a thinker about the mechanics of playing, and had a very clear notion about how to approach striking anything and making the kind of sound you wanted. And so he was very influential. He got me into thinking about circles and having there always be this circular path to the stroke. And so those are a lot of things that stuck with me over the years. But I studied with him while I was at school, and then I started to do freelancing and just play around town, and whatever came up. Could be a high school that was putting on a play of some kind, and I would join and play on the drum set and play in that, and then I would freelance around and play on timpani and with opera orchestras and stuff. So that went on for a couple of years, just playing, any kind of music that came along, playing in some shows, Broadway shows, and getting my feet wet in terms of the music business in New York City.
Yeah, just to interject, I wanted to you sparked something about Hinger in when we're studying, because I had the same experience, and I asked a few people in the past. Studying with a timpanist, classical percussion and stuff, there's something specific about timpani that really trains your sensitivity to melody and stroke the sound, because you can't get away with anything except perfection. It's how you get a nice tone out of the drum. So we spend countless hours, right, trying to make a good sound, which then really transfers to anything else you do, whether it's a frame drum or drum set or anything. And I think you become a lot more musical, or it helps you along that way. It's certainly, when I think back, I was a rock drummer when I started, and then studied classical percussion. But the thing that really struck me the most, and I fell in love with playing timpani, was the training that I got, like to be precise as far as the tuning, because there is like a fretless. You have to be totally in tune, and you always have to be sensitive to that. Getting the tone. Harvey Mason, who originally I knew him as a drummer, but then I saw him playing percussion at one of the PAS shows, and I was really surprised. And then he told me, he said, no, I studied with Vic Firth at the New England Conservatory. And then I understood why, his whole concept of sound and touch and I just would see that there's this commonality of all those people who did. And you certainly one of them, because I see, with my experience with you and, having studied with you also, and seeing you at work at the COSA camps for all those years. You were there, I counted them, 22 years. And 2025 is the 30th anniversary. Imagine that.
Wow.
Amazing. But what I'm saying is that sensitivity to tone, to musicality, I think now I trace it, because when I met you, I only knew you as a frame drummer. I didn't know your background. But the more that I hear you and learn about you, I see, now I get it. That makes total sense. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that is a really, really valid argument and perception about that timpanists are very, as you said, very attuned to sound and projection and tone and the mechanics of how you make a sound. So I hadn't thought about it either, but it's true that because Hinger was a timpanist, he was very focused on those issues. And I'm sure that his ideas about the circle and how to get a tone out of it, came out of this thing of articulation on the timpani, because it's such a huge issue, and
Sure.
also projection,
Yep.
because you're way back in the audience, and on the stage you're far away from the audience, and you're also playing a very low end instrument. So you have a lot of issues about how your sound gets from all the back to the audience.
Right.
So
right.
that makes you ask a lot of questions about those issues.
Yeah, and also the size of the room, because if you're the size of the orchestra, who's in front of you, the size of the room, this is a funny thing, because the person who really challenged me was Louis Charbonneau, who was the timpanist for the Montreal Symphony for 50 years.
Uh-huh.
And he was a colleague, very close, and used to actually sub for Vic Firth in the Boston Symphony. And it was Louis who told me. He says, no, the timpanist is the leader of the band. He or she projects and keeps the band together from the very back, and also being sensitive to the room and what kind of mallets you're using all the time. And every hall is different. Playing frame drums, you have to do that with your hands, so you have to project.
Yeah.
To the room, right? But there you have, you learn that whether it's something between your hands and the instrument or not, then you still have that sensitivity, or you have to factor that in your playing, and it becomes automatic, right?
Yeah. I guess it just makes you ask a lot of questions, and look for answers to a lot of different issues. One of the things that I used to enjoy listening to him talk about was playing in an orchestra and becoming sensitized to all the different sections and how they treat pitch, so that the trumpets will be often somewhat sharp. And so, in other words, when you're tuning, you're like paying attention to what section are you playing with in a particular piece, when you come in, and who is playing and what is their tendency in terms of where their pitch is. So it's, as I said, it's asking a lot of questions. It kind of forces you to confront a lot of different issues. And I think that had a big effect on me in terms of sound production, and even though I don't think about it anymore in those terms, because the issue with sticks is so much different than the issues with hands, So probably the basics are somewhat similar, but the physicality of what you're doing with your hands and your fingers differs so radically from what you do when you're playing with sticks. So it's a whole different arena of issues,
Right. Yeah, no, it's interesting, but I don't think there's a difference. I just had a flash when I would play in orchestras, doing work in town, like most people do. You're playing in the orchestra, and if you're playing with strings, if you're playing a xylophone part, well, xylophone responds so quickly and immediate, like your hands would on a frame drum, but strings would not. So you have to allow for that. So you kind of have to play late. And when I first learned that, I was fascinated, because you're going like this, bum, the sound comes after. Well, the strings can only, they have to position themselves, and there's a whole technicality of that. But learning how to play in that space was really interesting for me in two ways. When you're in the orchestra is one thing. With repercussion, we would do a lot of, and we still do a lot of orchestra appearances. So we have a lot of fun with the sections because sometimes things we do need to be like they're like, rhythmically unforgiving. So it has to be tight. So when we learned that we have to be, if it's flute, if it's trumpets or strings, they're not going to respond the same way. So often I would walk over to the strings, or one of the other guys would walk over to another section, so that we would kind of keep it together in a different way. That was interesting. With frame drums, I think it's the same because it's immediate. I mean, you're playing the frame. So sorry to get off on this tangent, but you just sparked this idea. I know you've played and do a lot of work with symphonies also. How do you deal with that now that I'm making that bridge, because I'm just thinking about it as we speak. When you're playing frame drums, often the orchestra may not be at the same rhythmic place, especially strings. That's just the nature of the beast. How do you deal with that?
Well, it's different with frame drums because the volume is always an issue. Unless you're playing a tambourine of some kind, the frame drum itself is not really a very loud instrument, and there are styles of playing that are very loud. Like the Central Asian styles with the doira, and they can really crack a loud sound. But my style, which involves a lot of fingering and a lot of density and whatever, and it's not very loud. So when I'm playing the times that I've done things with orchestra, I'm always amplified. So they're hearing an amplified version of what I do. And if I played acoustically straightforward, it probably wouldn't work. And it's something that is, a big issue in the frame drum situation, because the amplification of frame drums, I've never really heard it be really very good. I don't know that anybody has really solved that issue in the sense of my style, because it's all about these subtleties and the Sure. difference between one sound and another, and the richness of the tones between all the different sounds. So to capture that, I've never heard it done in terms of playing it in a very amplified setting, in other words, playing with a jazz group or something like that, where there are loud instruments like the drum set and all the amplified instruments. I've never really heard it done in a way that felt very satisfying, because the nature of that situation means that you have to reduce the subtlety of what you're doing to be heard, and you have to choose one or two or three sounds and just have those be the ones that are really prominent and heard. The subtlety of it, is something else. And it would be like, saying, well, have you ever heard a lute in an amplified, playing with a rock band? It would be the same thing. Sure. It's the nature of the instrument. It's quieter. It's more subtle. The range is less than other instruments, and especially when you're talking about a louder range of sound. So I'm always prefer and look for acoustic situations where the other instruments are also dealing with similar issues, and then we're kind of in the same playing field.
Right. Yeah, no, it certainly wasn't the context where those instruments were born in the first place, and they're now we're playing in front of thousands of people. I wonder though, in a situation where you're playing in one of those Greek theaters, if everyone is acoustic, and you're playing to 2,000 people, but in one of those Greek theaters. I think that would work even with framers, because we did it with repercussion. I was just so surprised. And in Greece, for example, playing in those Greek theaters, and I remember once I stood up and I said, we were in Athens or Crete, I don't remember which, and I went to the front and I saw the technician. I said, what time does the sound system arrive so we can do a sound check? So they're all looking at each other. and then I realized, oh, I said something weird. And then as I'm speaking, I'm right in the center of the stage, talking to them. And I'm hearing myself as if I was wearing headphones. And this is when it dawned on me. I said, all those Greek plays, that people would be thousands. And they hear everything. And there was no amplification thousands of years ago. I said, amazing. So we played totally acoustic. And it was fabulous. So we could speak, and then and you could hear.
Yeah.
I think that would be neat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, also with the amplification, it works fine if it's other frame drums or other acoustic instruments. It's with electric instruments, really, that becomes such an issue. But I've done many concerts with groups of frame drums where we're all playing amplified, and it's fine because you're all in the same arena.
Right, right. Just to get back a little bit, because you've done so much in the arena of frame drum, in the world arena of this, and you're the person that's always referred to. I mean, I remember when I wanted to study, of course, I said, well, the man to study with is Glen Velez, because you took all of these cultures and you brought them to a stage or to a place where we would understand how they mix together, take the tradition and move forward with it, and do other things with them, and develop techniques, different genres, or things that we would understand. It's without going to all those various cultures ourselves. I mean, you're the man. You've done all of that, and you've done so much for that percussion world. How did you begin that part of the journey?
Well, let's see. As I was mentioning before, I was doing this freelancing, and I started to play with Steve Reich, and we were playing. That's mallets. I was doing a lot of mallet playing, and two of the guys in the group were Nexus guys, Bob Becker and Russell Hartenberger, and so through them, I started to become connected with the world drumming scene, because I knew that Russ was studying South Indian drumming and Bob was studying North Indian drumming. And for some reason, I was just drawn to the South Indian style drumming. It's a lower drum and kind of more earthy than the tabla. And so I just said to Russ, I'd like to study that. I'd always been interested in Indian music from the time I heard the Beatles,
right.
Back in the 60s. And I just liked the sound of it, it had such a slowdown in terms of when you compare with Western music, there was all this space and slowdown of the time feeling. So I dug that. And so I asked Russ if I could study, with his teacher, and his teacher was named Ramnad Raghavan, and that's who he studied with at Wesleyan. And that fellow came to live in New York for a while, and so I made contact with him and started to study the South Indian style of drumming. And during one of the lessons on mridangam, the big South Indian drum, he saw a tambourine on my wall and said, we play that in South India also. So I said, oh, I didn't know that. And so he picked it up and started to play the Kinjira style of playing. And Kinjira is the South Indian frame drum. So that was my introduction to the whole thing. That was back in 1970, around 76, 77. And as soon as I saw that, I thought, oh, that's cool. It's such a, here's all the stuff you can do with a tambourine, you know. I'd never seen anything like it. So I said, let's study that also. And so we started to study that. And two things were really like a drastic shift that gradually happened for me. One was that I started to become more and more aware of the possibility of this very simple drum. You know, it's just a little tiny thing with one little jingle there. There was a coin or something. And there was all this rhythmic material that you could get out of it. And because the drum was tuned very low, you had a lot of pitch possibility also. So it was, okay, something very simple that you could do a lot with. And I really liked that idea because up until that point, for me, it had been drum set, timpani, chimes, and marimbas, and all the big stuff that I'd been playing with. And this idea that you could take this little thing and do really wonderful things with it just was radical to me. And so, you know, I started to go to the library at that point and started to look around because I thought there are probably other tambourine styles around that I should look into, because here's one that I found, and I bet you there's others. And of course, I started to find out about Middle Eastern tambourine and Brazilian tambourine and South Italian tambourine. So the lucky thing was that I was in New York, and so I was able to find teachers of those styles, those different things. The second one was the Arabic tambourine. I started to go to concerts at the World Music Institute and Asia Society, where they had ongoing world music concerts, and I saw a guy play the tambourine really nicely, Lebanese man named Hana Merhij. And his drummer was a very famous his brother was a very famous tambourine player named Michel Merhij, who played with a lot of the big name singers and musicians in the Middle East. But Hana was a very good player also, and so I started to take lessons from him and studied with him, and so I had those two at that point. And what another dramatic thing that I was being introduced to was vocalizations, drum language, which I hadn't been introduced before. You know, Western style of teaching is in terms of numbers. So 1 eana, 2 eana, and 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And these other styles of teaching are based on sounds, not numbers, but the sounds of the drum. And I know that's similar in Africa and many other traditions, but these were the two that I was introduced to, and they were really very systematic, and especially the South Indian one. So that has been a theme from then until now. The value and the possibility that vocalizations can play a really, really powerful and beneficial role in learning and experiencing drumming. So all of that was, you know, what led up to finding out more and more about the frame drums.
And you developed, of course, the whole vocalization. And now you have Lori, your wife, who sings with you and works with you. And she's an amazing singer. We've seen her at COSA, and she's just amazing. But every time I see you or hear what you're doing, and all the records that you've done are just pushing the envelope further and further, which is fantastic. Thanks for doing that. I'm on behalf of everyone I know. But and you're still expanding that whole idea of the vocalization, because it is a natural thing in most cultures, right? Singing and drumming, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, it's something that's so natural that everyone kind of comes onto it eventually. You know, even drum set players, I mean, most of the great drummers are doing some kind of internal vocalization, you know, whether it's often in our situation, it's intuitive. People just invent their own invent their own version of that. But it still amounts to the same aspect, that you're kind of filling your mind with vocals that represent what you're doing, and also synchronizing your breathing by vocalizing.
And what made you decide to push that? I know I remember the whole. The cavity of our head, being able to shape frequencies, and then depending on how you shape it, different frequencies come out. And it's fascinating when I first heard you do that. What have you come up with? I mean, you've been doing this for years. That you would say is phenomenal for you to push you onward in that.
Well, you were mentioning the overtone singing,
Yes.
Right? Yeah, okay. So there's two angles to the vocalizations. One is the rhythmic vocalizations, which represent all the rhythms that you can play on a drum. And the other is the overtone singing, which is from kind of another realm, which involves deep breathing and the exact opposite of rhythm singing, which is parsing smaller and smaller units. So you can go, so you can say these small units that represent what you're doing when you're playing quick rhythms. But the overtone singing is the exact opposite. You go as slow as you can from one syllable to another. So this kind of dichotomy between these two things, I also find that really fascinating, that you have way to sing very slowly that illuminates and creates a whole nother perception about your experience of sound. And you have this very quick way of articulating rhythm that does the same thing. It gives you this avenue to explore very dense material in terms of rhythm, very dense and syncopated material. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you have this very slow, deep breathing that gives you a kind of out of time experience. So both of those things are two angles to how I use the voice, because when I'm playing and I'm using these more dense rhythms that you create syncopations with and a lot of different sounds, you combine that with a slow, deep breathing, and with the overtones, you have this duality that's going on between something very slow and something much quicker. And then you're trying to synchronize them. And of course, synchronization is the other aspect of drumming that we're all immersed in. Without that, there's nothing happening. Synchronization between us and others, other individuals and other music, other sounds. And that synchronization is what gives us this burst of energy as we learn how to synchronize, And so the overtones with the drumming is something that I found has that same kind of experience for me and gives me a lot of satisfaction and a lot of roads to follow in terms of different ideas about how to make music.
Yeah, and also one of the things that I've always been fascinated by your sense of innovation. I mean, with everything, whether you're studying Cuban, African, Brazilian, or any of the other styles or cultures, there's first you're going deep into the culture, understanding where that's coming from, the tradition. But then there's also those tradition folks themselves understand that the importance of to keep the tradition is not to lock it up, is to make it evolve. And I learned that, with studying people from Cuba, from Africa, and most of the others, and that commonality of innovation, doing something new with the old, and therefore the old, I shouldn't say old, but the tradition is actually maintained while you're moving forward in an evolution, which kind of sounds funny because most people think, well, no, we should stay in the tradition and forget about the new stuff. New stuff is new stuff. The traditions are traditions, which is not so. And I learned that many of the great masters in the traditions are also far ahead of us in their own traditions while keeping that tradition alive. They're modernizing and finding some evolution. One of the things I remember that kind of it really surprised me once I had listened to one of the many things that you've done is this Trio Globo record I bought, and I'm listening to it, and I said, wow, that's amazing. And I said, well, I'm going to learn how he does this before Glen comes back to the Koza camp next summer, and I'm going to show him this. I remember I said this to you, but it was amazing. I'm hearing this brush on a drum, and I'm hearing all of these other things. And I said, I figured out how he did that. This is maybe 20 years ago. I don't remember now. And I said, I know how he does that. So I created a pedal brush that I put on a pedal, bass drum pedal on a 14-inch drum that I still use. And I said, and then a rick here. And I'm doing all of these things. And I remember the day when I was so proud of myself, I said, Glen, I listened to that album and I figured it out. Look. And you looked at me and you said, it's very nice, but that's not what I did.
Yeah.
Wow. That was amazing. Yeah. I mean, it took me into another path, which is nice, but it was interesting to see how you did it with one brush and everything was on one drum. And your innovations in all of those things, just mixing, coming up with new ideas, I was always, how should I say, inspiring. But you've been doing this a long time, and it was just fantastic. How does can you explain some of the things that you came up with and what took you there?
Well, I think part of it was initially what I was doing. I was during the first probably 4 or 5 years of studying the frame drums, there started to happen this gradual osmosis of one technique bleeding into another drum. In other words, a technique that I'd learned on one drum started to bleed into another drum, and it just kind of happened naturally. So that was one aspect of it, and I didn't intend on doing that. It just happened naturally, because just from studying a couple of different styles. And the other thing was the feeling that the more I found out about frame drums, the more I started to find out about the history and the lineage of frame drumming. And that was something that I was not aware of, because there was no lineage that I knew of in Western culture about frame drumming. But there's all these very old lineages, from ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia. All these ancient cultures had very strong traditions of frame drumming. And when I started to look into that, I started to be very inspired by that and have a feeling that there was a connection between that era, an era 2,000 years ago or so, where frame drumming was popular and found very readily in a lot of different manifestations, and all using the hands. And that just felt, I was connected to that. And I didn't see anything around me that I could connect to in that way. It's like, you see all the great drummers on drum set, and you feel connected to the lineage of Joe Jones and all the older guys that started out, playing up until now. But there was no lineage on frame drum, and so I hooked in with that. And that was also very inspiring, and that gave me the feeling that there was something that I was doing that made sense in a musical sense, that there was value to it. And because initially I didn't have any outlet for this frame drumming, because when I studied the Arabic tambourine, I would start to play with Hana on some of his gigs and go to play along. But it was this, very narrow picture of what you could do, and it was very specific. The technique and the style was specific to that music, and you had to play within that parameter, and it was very important that you did that because that's what the other musicians expected to hear. If you did something crazy, then it was like jolting to them. So the situations that I had were very traditional in that way. And this other thing that I was developing was outside of that parameters because it was just different thing. It was using a combination of techniques, and I didn't know what kind of music it would fit into, So I had to learn what kind of music works for the frame drum and what kind of music works for this style. So an important area that happened for me was a man named Charlie Morrow, who was quite an active musician and composer, and he did a lot of jingle writing and a lot of different avenues of the music scene in New York. But one of the things he was really interested in was in improvising. So he would create little ensembles that improvised. And the thing about these ensembles was that they had no tradition behind them. They were just, let's get together and improvise.
Right.
Whether you bring a trumpet, you bring a kazoo, and you bring this and that, and so I got hooked in with him and did some of his traditional things that he was doing, like in the studios and whatnot, but also these improvisatory ensembles that he was very interested in. And that was a perfect venue for me to experiment because there was no parameter, there was no tradition, there was no nothing. It was just, let's improvise and see if we can make some music that's fun to do together. And so that was an ideal situation for me to experiment with my frame drums. And also it gave me a chance to see how the frame drums fit with different instruments and different situations, different size ensembles, and different specific instruments, which instruments worked better.
Right.
And that was like maybe a 4 or 5 year period where I was doing that kind of thing, along with playing my gigs that I was doing to make a living, playing with different ensembles, a lot of new music and contemporary music and stuff. So there was all this mix that allowed me to make these advances in what I was doing. And then when I started to do more of playing around and playing a little bit more adventuresome music in terms of how I could use the frame drum, I started to play with a man named Paul Winter.
Yes.
And in that context, it was a little bit more jazzy, a little bit more traditional. And he was very interested in world music, so he liked all the different drums. So that allowed me to start experimenting and playing with piano and cello and saxophones and different instruments that I could really see what worked and what instruments worked better and what kind of combinations worked better in the sense. So all of that mix was how I developed what I did.
Yeah, and Paul Winter was amazing in that he gathered all of these great performers. I remember seeing one of his productions, Winter Solstice, if I remember correctly, at
Solstice, yeah.
the John Devine Cathedral, right?
Yeah.
One of those cathedrals, and you and a number of other people were playing in different settings, and Paul just managed to glue all of that together. That whole idea was amazing. Was that going back to the other improvisation period with that setting where people were just improvising with whatever instruments were there? Was there a preset a chart or an idea, or people would just start playing and others would join in, like free form type? Was it like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Free form. It was totally free form.
Nice.
And that was also a lot of fun for me, coming from all the new music and the written music and everything sad and playing exactly what you're supposed to play, this was like exactly the opposite. So I was very lucky to fall into that. That kind of allowed my imagination to just go wherever it wanted to, without any form. And yeah, I think that played a big role in allowing me to do a lot of experiments with the frame drum and experiment a lot with the techniques and the combinations, and which, the low end drums and the ones with jingles, the rick, all the different combinations, that were possible. So that period was I think played a big role in how I developed.
And then you worked with taking those colors and those concepts, working and recording with people like Pat Metheny, Lyle Mays, and those other creative people who always were looking for something new and different sounds, different ideas, expanding kind of the thinking outside the box a little bit, right? So you were in the right place at the right time with the right people. That helped you do that, right?
World music influences were really affecting everybody during the 60s and 70s, So everybody was starting to wanting to hear some new sounds, like, as you're saying, something a little bit different from what had been going on since the early part of the century.
Right. It's interesting because there is so much, and what's really interesting for me. I mean, I'm Southern Italian. I was born in Calabria, and I grew up with the tarantella, people playing that everyone played, and it was just a common thing. And now that I go back to Italy often, and we have a place there, and I spend a few months a year, and I just. The traditions are there, but then you have people who have taken those traditions to a whole other level. I mean, there's this big festival in Puglia that is phenomenal. There are 100,000 people that show up for this whole festival. It's televised. The RAI puts on this mega production of all of these players with mixes to a whole other level, which is beautiful to see. And I'm sure that's going on in other places, because that drum, that little round thing, jingles or no jingles, is like is as common as air to many different cultures, right? And did you do any research in saying, okay, where did it start? The Romans, women were playing a lot more the frame drums in the beginning in certain parts, and how did that end up in Brazil, in the whole Middle East, and in India? I mean, where was this tracing? Did you do much of that? Because I find it fascinating that this same instrument is called different names and played differently depending on the culture.
Yeah, no, it's one of those deep pits that you can fall into in terms of the history of this drum. So number one, the frame drum is by miles the most documented drum of any kind of drum. The documentation of it, because it was a favorite in the ancient world, a favorite of artists, whether they were sculptural or painters or whatever kind of art they did. The frame drum, because it involved motion and it was so tied to ritual, and representing ritual was such an important part of ancient art, ancient representations.
Right.
And the frame drum was often part of those rituals in the ancient Mediterranean world. So that's one aspect of it. So you can easily go online and find thousands of representations of frame drums from many different eras, many cultures. The other thing is that the that I think is interesting, especially in terms of the Italian frame drum, the tamborellos, is from my research, the instrument was actually invented in southern Italy. The very first representations of this combination of frame drum and disc jingles. So disc jingles, cymbals, small cymbals are very, very old also. The frame drum was from the earliest representations are from around 2500 before the Christian era. So that's about 4,500 years ago. So the frame drum was around for a couple of thousand years, along with the disc jingles were also around. So they coexisted, and they were often played in groups. One person would play the cymbals, the small cymbals. Another person would play the frame drum. So the combination of those two sounds was something that people were very familiar with. But for 2,000 years, nobody thought of cutting little holes in the frame drum and putting those jingles inside of it. And the first time that appears are on these Roman sarcophagi from the 2nd century CE, so the 2nd century after the Christian era. And those were played by maenads, who were celebrants in the rituals of the mother goddess and the various other important deities. And so on these sarcophagi, which are coffins, stone coffins, they would have these ritualistic scenes, and often you would see maenads playing the frame drum. And that's the first time you start to see anyone play a tambourine, per se. That's a frame drum with jingles. So it was invented there. As far as, I have these, many thousands of depictions. There's a lot of representations of frame drums. And there's frame drums with pellet bells on the inside. And that goes back also very far. But the idea of the cymbals, that's something that's very specific, and that's what we call tambourine. So there's tremendous amount of material, yet to be discovered. And for drummers who are scholarly types who want to explore the history aspect of this, there's a huge amount of material. There's, all these interesting times when the frame drum blossomed out periodically. There's the time in 1790s when the frame drum became very popular in England.
Right.
And their composers started to write concertos and different elaborate pieces. And they had to invent a notation system to represent all the things they were doing on frame drum. And that is connected with the Janissary music, which came from Turkey in the 1600s and went into Europe. That's how the instruments that Mozart and Beethoven started to use in the orchestra, the cymbals and the tambourine and the bass drum, they were started to be used because it represented Turkish music. And that was a specific sound, that people were interested in representing in orchestral setting. So then it traveled west, got to England, and then became a whole other thing where these tambourine players they were musicians that were imported from the slave colonies in the Caribbean into England, into London, and they gave them drums because they intuited or they knew these guys are going to become good drummers, or possibly be good drummers. That's number one. And number two, they were big. They were tall guys.
Okay.
So they would give them big, elaborate costumes, put big feathers on their heads, and show them how to play these Turkish instruments. And they became very skilled. And there's a famous thing in the Buckingham Palace when you have the casting of the guards. So the guards would come out and march around, and they would change the changing of the guards at Buckingham Palace. And the band, called the Coldstream Guards, they still do this to this day. They come out and play some marches, and the guard changes, and then the band goes back inside, and there's new guards. That was going on in the 1790s, and this Coldstream Guards band was one of the first to adopt these Turkish instruments. And so you had these black guys, and there's a lot of paintings of these guys because they became a cultural phenomena. They became very adept at playing tambourine, and they started to teach women how to play tambourine. And that's how this whole thing developed, of the tambourine being a salon instrument that you could play and have written music for and play along with the piano and harp, and etc., and had to develop a notation system for it. That lasted about 40 years, from 1790 to about 1830, and then it died away.
Wow.
And that was it. Everybody forgot about it. The music is still around, and it was, collected in the British Library. I went and did some research trips over there and got the music. And in 1981, I played one of the pieces with Nexus at the PAS convention. It's called Grand Sonata for Tambourine and Piano, and they arranged the piano part for marimbas.
Right.
And we played it, and people thought we were putting them on. Really, they thought, hey, they're putting this on. There's a tambourine thing, this guy's twirling the tambourine and doing these funny sounds on it, and the music behind it is very kind of rococo, dum 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 dum.
Right.
The tambourine would come in, and I had the music, so I was interpreting all the different sounds that they were making, and they had created a whole style, a whole technique. And there were specific tambourines, because the military bands at that time were starting to use the tambourines. So there were tambourine makers that were making the tambourines that fit the specific style. You had to have a special cutout for the thumb hole. And usually they made it out of mother of pearl, so that it was very easy on the thumb. And part of the technique was the twirling, because you would go, you would go like that and twirl it up.
Right.
And so they invented a style of notation where the number of twirls on the stem of the note told you how many times to twirl the drum. So, there was all these very specific slides and different kinds of techniques that they invented. And probably this is an interesting aspect of it, because a lot of the poor people from Italy and from the poor parts of Europe would travel into Europe and play instruments on the street music. And they also would wind up in London. And by that means, a lot of people in Europe were hearing traditional music from the countryside of southern Italy, of different parts of Eastern Europe, and that was traveling around, and it was like considered, you would give money to these people, and there became a whole thing about the system that was the Italians created a system for brokers who would get young children out of the Italian villages, teach them how to play the instrument enough so they could send them on their way to France, Germany, and England to play on the street and send money back. So anyway, that's part of the tambourine story and how it traveled, because it's such a indigenous instrument in all these different places in Europe and in the Mediterranean world.
Amazing, yeah. And then ending up also in Brazil, and yeah. That's amazing. Well, that's a beautiful story. It's interesting. I'm so happy you brought that up because, when you know some history, when you know something, but there's a piece missing. Like, how did that get to that? One thing jumping to another. What was that bridge, for example? So it always feels good to learn and without doing your own history research, of course. So that's beautiful. I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah,
and we're still playing them today,
crazy,
right? Yeah, crazy. Yeah. Amazing. And of course, you're still traveling and you're still developing, you're still promoting. And I mean, I've seen people do different variations of those drums. There was a fellow in Italy who had a drum that had a mechanism. I can't remember his name now. It'll come to me. Where he developed a mechanism inside that would change the pitch, so it wasn't just a pitch that you do with the tamborello, as bending the head. It was a whole mechanism inside that he would hold, and that would change the pitch, and then
Carlo Rizzi.
Yes.
Yeah,
and,
he took it from the idea of the bicycle spokes.
Okay.
And he invented that 30 years ago.
Right. I remember seeing him in concert. I believe it was in Montreal when he did that, or in Italy. I don't remember now, but I remember being fascinated, and I said, "There's so much we could do with all of these instruments," and I remember at one point, because all of us get into this idea of how many instruments can you possibly have, and they just grow on you. I mean, this is my playground, and I remember saying to you show up with a bag, and all the instruments are in one bag, and that's it. Just one bag, your instrument, and you're all set up. And I looked at the guys in my group. I says, now, Glenn is probably one of the smartest musicians I know. It takes him 5 minutes to set up and 5 minutes to take down, and you're good. But so much. I mean, you said it well. Doing a lot with so little, and that's huge.
Yeah, I think it's like it's something, that idea attracted me right away. That the instrument was so almost crude. That just a frame, put a skin on it of some kind, and have a jingle or two, or whatever, and have that be the instrument that you spend your time and energy on. What can I do on this? How much can I do on this? It's such a cool idea, and I think it was also a reaction to all the elaborate instruments that we have. The piano, the synthesizers, and all that. It's like that's one end of the spectrum. So what's on the other end of the spectrum?
Just one drum. To me, that's amazing, and also, it really challenges the imagination, and giving yourself those limits, or those parameters that you have to work within. And I think that's amazing. I remember once Ayrto, because I asked him, I said, "How do you work on all these instruments?" He says, "Well, you take a triangle, you lock yourself up in the room for days, and all you do is you play the triangle, and it's the same idea. And if you do that, you come up with a lot of possibilities, a lot of. I mean, to me, it's endless. I mean, it's the same thing that you've been doing. Is just this little drum, and all those incredible possibilities that you can come with. Of course, your own training helps you in that, but using your imagination and having that limitation. I mean, limitation meaning the challenge of really focusing and then going deep in that particular item, which is huge, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it definitely has a charm. The idea has a charm to it.
Easy to travel, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, I'm really happy that we finally caught up and we're able to have this conversation. And of course, we can go on for days because there's so much to talk about and to learn about all of these various frame drums. Frame drums meaning, I mean, how would you describe the frame drum for the people who are not frame drummers but would not want to understand? I know you have one right there because I heard it. Is it a Rick?
Yeah, I have a Rick right here.
Nice.
So, yeah, a frame drum is any drum that the distance from one side of the head to the other, so the diameter of the head, is quite a bit more than the depth of the shell. And of course, there's a point where it's kind of can be equal, and then is it a frame drum? Is it a tom-tom? So it's a loose concept, but basically the concept is this is much larger than this, the depth of the shell. And that has a lot of ramifications because, number one, it means that probably it's going to be able to be handheld. It's going to be light enough that you could deal with it by holding it in some way. And another important ramification, which we kind of touched on earlier, is the way that the drum can project. Because frame drums don't project like a deeper shelled drum.
Right.
A conga or a djembe, those drums will project quite far because of the depth of the shell. You've got a resonating chamber. Well, these don't have any resonating chamber. The resonating chamber is so small that the sound really dissipates fast. So that's another aspect of frame drums, that you can be playing, here, and you have your frame drum like this, and you're getting the sound, and it sounds great to you, and it's amazing because it's like surround sound for the player. But how far it projects is not as far as a normal drum would. I mean, if someone's in the same room, yeah. But if someone's on the back of a hall and you're playing like this, the sound is, quite soft. So
Yeah.
that projection aspect is a big aspect of frame drums also, and so those two qualities that it has. Now, when you add jingles, of course, you add a whole other array of possibility, because for instance, in the Rick, the style is predicated on controlling the jingles. So the idea is it's a drum first, and you can play it like it sounds. Play it like a drum, and it sounds like a drum, and you hear maybe some little jingle. Or you can play on the jingles, and then you have another whole array of sound. Or you can combine the two. But it's all about controlling that aspect of it. If you want jingles, then you hold it a certain way, and you play a certain way so that you control the jingles. So that's one of the beauties of Rick, and one of the geniuses of playing it in the Middle Eastern style is that it's a style that controls the jingles, so you can have a drum or you can have a jingle instrument. And that's probably one of the biggest differences between that and, let's say, the South Italian style, because the South Italian style is very much predicated on the sound of those jingles,
Right.
And there's a lot of other stuff going on, but that jingle sound is really the thing that sets off the specific South Italian energy, for the tambourine. And that means that a lot of technique and a lot of thought and a lot of work was into how can we play these jingles in different ways to make different rhythmic combinations,
Yeah,
So
interesting.
that's the thing about the frame drum, this little instrument, that you can spend a lot of time focusing on one aspect of it or another.
Right. And also, just a quick question. When you're miking the instrument for recording or live playing, I've come up with situations where people will mic it from the front, but I say, no, the sound is coming from the other side. So you want to capture this, just like a djembe. Djembe, if you mic the top, you're not going to get the bottom. So you really, a djembe, you really want to mic it from the bottom because that's where the sound is coming. 90% of the sound is coming from there. The higher pitch from here, but the body of the sound is down there. And that's in the frame drums. Is it the same? Do you tell people, or do you ask people to mic it from the other end, is like what you're hearing? Because there's a different sound that you hear as the player, as opposed to someone in the front, which is maybe more of the higher pitch, more of the high frequencies.
Yes, it's a it's an interesting situation with the frame drum because, as I was mentioning, the sound out here is quite a bit different from the sound here. Even the sound a couple of feet away,
right?
You know, they're getting a lot more of, as you mentioned, the overtones, quite a bit more of the overtones, and here you're getting more of the bottom end plus the overtones. So, you know, in terms of the studio and the miking that I do in the studio, I'll have both going on, you know, having the microphone back here that can get, and it depends on the drum. For the Rick, I wouldn't even have a mic back here,
right?
Because there's very little low end. And really what you want to have, the low end is that, you know, so that's not very low end. So the mic out here gets everything that you need. But for a lower pitched drum, a larger frame drum, yeah, I would have a mic back here to get that low end, and the front to get the overtone sounds that are there also. The other thing is that this is an interesting aspect of the frame drum. The pitch back here is slightly different than the pitch here. And so that you can tune the drum really nicely and you hear it nicely up here, but someone here might hear it a little bit differently. So you have to be aware of that pitch difference that there is, depending on whether you're behind or whether you're in front of the drum.
Interesting. Yeah. Now there's so much more than what it looks like. This little drum. What an invention. And I thank you so much for Glen for taking the time to explain it. Of course, we can go really deep into different areas and different cultures and where things came from. But it's really nice that you have taken this on for all of these years, and for as long as I've known you. And you started way before, of course, and you're still on that path, on that journey of the frame drum journey. And it's funny because all those cultures could just come together, and it recognizes no language, no culture. These are rhythms. You know, we say the universal language, but this is super universal.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
it's great. You know, it leads you down many different roads.
Yeah, and thank you for all the inspiration. And I always say, to be continued.
All right, thank you.